Hello everyone, thanks for turning out fairly early in the morning. My presentation follows in the footsteps of our distinguished speakers from yesterday as we collectively question, contest and connect archives and historiographies to imagine the meanings and signifiers of other Everest stories, testimonies, silences, omissions and erasures. I do this today with images drawn mostly from my forthcoming monograph, Mountains of Empire. They seek to explore how the Himalayas, footloose laboring children, men, women, and other species constituted the embodied, hidden in plain sight infrastructure of mountain empire. These two maps represent in different ways British India's frontier geographies for much of that infrastructure, the hill station towns of Darjeeling, Kalimpong and their connected hinterlands. Starting with the application of labor sociologist Jan Bremen's concept of footloose labor, I bring before us today an assemblage of archival bricolage, both hidden in plain sight testimonies of indigenous labor and as multi-species material histories that take us between what many historians and systems theorists conceived as the metropole and the peripheries, which we can question today, perhaps as borderlands. And the bricolage also is to be connected, I hope, to what historian Christine Lee Hogganson terms as consumer's imperium in the reading that she does of the global production of North American domesticity. We begin, however, right here in London, where Royal Academy artist Frank Stone exhibited this painting of Joseph Hooker in 1858. And of course, most people are familiar with the mezzotint by Walker, of which 100 engravings were sold at 200 guineas each. Together with the illustrations contained in Hooker's journals, which had been published 4 years earlier, in 1854, my math is a bit weak, and also with sundry publications through that decade, these might have been some of the earliest images of purporting to be of indigenous porters and also of Nepali troops displayed before metropolitan audiences. And it might be instructive here to remember that it was a good 10 years before Darjeeling's first administrator, Archibald Campbell's talk on lepchas and the exhibit that he did for the Ethnological Society of their implements and photographs. And in fact, one of the material histories that I hope you'll find recurring through this presentation, and I've pointed it with the arrow, the bamboo basket anchored by the doko, the head strap. Such baskets and other implements are also familiar to many in this audience from the artifacts that Hooker himself brought back to Kew, but there are also artifacts deposited by Campbell and others, notably in the Pitt Rivers, which ended up eventually in the Pitt Rivers collection and others. So these are some of the traces we find of the embodied mountain laboring histories whose voices we obviously lack, but they also serve as testimonies to the post-colonial human lived ecologies, because that basket, that head strap are implements that you would see today very much still on the roads and hillsides of the Eastern Himalayas. I also wanted to point out at this point that many present-day lepchas prefer the name Rong, derived from the phrase Mutanchi Rong Kuprum Kup, children of the snowy peaks, notably Kanchanjunga, the big stone, from whose snows they believe were born their ancestors, Tukbothing and Nazong New. Another archival image from London, this time from the V&A, round the corner. Courtesy a surgeon, de Fabec, and this time it purports to show coolies at Darjeeling. The task of these porters was to carry not plants, as the previous porters would have been doing for the most part, or as well as Hooker and his companions' luggage on the expeditions, but the main task was to carry live human bodies, ailing ones, those of the European officers invalidated to the military sanatorium at Jalapahar, which was actually the first rationale for the colonial British to enter these high altitudes. Because it's also instructive to remember here that it was not necessarily a given that a settlement should be built all that way up in the mountains. It was the, many people have written about that, but it was really the diktats of medicine and science which drove that impulse. But British India had a scant supply of both suitable animal power and the roads transport infrastructure of other mountain spaces. It possessed, however, seemingly in abundance, the dispossessed bodies of footloose labor. As I've written elsewhere, in this image, the attire, or rather the lack of attire and footwear of these men betrays their social origins. They are laborers drawn from the plains of the Indian subcontinent, the same spaces that supplied labor for the Indian Ocean, as far as the Caribbean and Fiji, as well as to plantations from Assam to Natal, or even closer to this space, to the coal mines of Jharkhand. And again, that differentiation in terms of the racialization and the particular groups of labor is something that's important for us to remember, especially as we move through the chronology. And the arrow here is just to direct your attention to the bare feet. Again, a motif that you will see will recur through this presentation. For the next slide, we actually go to the archive of the National Museum of Cardiff, where Edward Lear, yes, the same person who wrote the limericks, a celebrated artist of his era, journeyed to Darjeeling and Sikkim for a series of Kanchenjunga paintings, which were actually aristocratic commissions, including from the then Viceroy, Lord Northbrook. Note the picturesque juxtaposition of imagined locals vis-a-vis the towering mountains. As we move on to the implement that was actually indispensable for most of these scenes to come into being, the dundee, referred to as sedan chairs in some of the literature. And this is one of the many, many representations which are there of these dandies and their porters. And you might find it interesting, as I did many years ago when I started looking at some of these traces, that when the World Transport Commission came to the Eastern Himalayas, it had gone through the world, and in fact the same American photographer who became celebrated for his views of Wyoming, Yellowstone and the like, was the photographer who took the photographs. And in fact there were two kinds of photographs that took away from Darjeeling. One was of the train and the other was of the dandies. And again, it is instructive for us to look at the attire and again the footwear and the lack of the different porters. And certainly I have a vision, possibly for a later part of this project or maybe another project, of a type of crowdsourcing to arrive at a better locally informed understanding of the turbans and the dress that the porters wear, as well as the social differentiation that seems to be indicated by the footwear and the like, because certainly the figure on what is on my left hand side, those boots are consistent with the description we have of Tibetans wearing boots made in their own households, but then we have the bare feet of the gentleman to my right. So next slide. So this bricolage comes in the form of a stereograph image. I also want to note here, because again, it's, I think, important for us, whether historians, anthropologists, or others, to think about the not just the provenance of such images, but also about why they are there. And I can tell you, from having spent a good more than a decade of my life working on the sub-Himalayas, as in the Assam zone, that the plains of Assam are notably lacking in images of these kind. That you get those images when you come to the people who the colonial rulers found either interesting or threatening, or both. And so the generation of this huge, copious type of imagery and bricolage from the Eastern Himalayas is significant, again, of the consumer's imperium that was coming into being, as well as, of course, of the other things like the great game and so on, which many people have written about. So to get back to this image, so this comes to us in the form of a stereographic image, and again, this was hugely important up to into the early years of the 20th century, and it could be an entire PhD dissertation in itself, that type of circulation, the ways in which stereographic photographs were disseminated not just into books, but also in the form of shows into different countries. And certainly I found traces of these images being shown at small towns all across North America, and quite possibly in different parts of not just the present day UK, but also of some European spaces. So the stereographic images and of course others are accompanied by assertions about the ways in which women are put to work in hard manual labor. And of course this is exquisitely ironic because we have all the wealth of historical work about the women workers who had performed similar work in collieries and other establishments in the metropole itself. But this is used in the literature of empire as an illustration of various assertions about gender, labor, the character of the societies, which I don't have time to go into right now. But so that's one thing we can think about. The other thing, however, that I do want us to consider, and this actually connects to something that people had brought up yesterday, is how a very significant point of erasure and silencing is about the really important role that women played in this overall laboring proletariat that I'm trying to build up through this presentation. And it's important because certain types of representations endure. And this is where I would point people to the seminal work of P.R. Chatterjee in Her Time for Tea, and the work that other people have done, notably Shamita Sen, myself, and others. And of course it connects with a couple of the images Midhu showed us yesterday from her, the collection of the collective. But I think again it's important to historicize it, because that I deliberately, by the way, did not bring forward an image of tea workers, because having written about tea for a good part of my life, it's good to avoid repeating oneself. But it does come in, because what I would submit is, starting with this image, you're going to see other women, other images of women laborers. And again, that has to be considered in terms of the female heavy laboring force, but the female constituents of that labor force who have somehow dropped out of sight. And I would say that is not only because of colonial stereotyping, it's also because of local stereotyping, where in the South Asian social structure, societies perceive themselves as having risen up the social ladder if their women are secluded from public view, or at least from being seen to be work publicly. Yeah, so a lot packed in here, but these are the women porters, and this is specifically at the point where the train did not go up all the way up to Darjeeling, and so in fact luggage had to be carried for a few miles, and so we hear that it is women porters who are doing that labor. There are other stereographs which show, I think I actually have a couple of them, using infrastructural implements like road rollers and so on. Okay, so I now want to move on to the next part of my presentation, which looks at other Everests through local global encounters and contact zone. And again, this draws on the collection that a set of multidisciplinary scholars, Harris, Weerbeck, Holmstuck, Chungdarpa and I co-edited, which appeared a few years ago. And so we did use the notion of the contact zone to kind of tie together the different writings. But since my own scholarship and learning has evolved, what I also want to bring to the fore is not just the notion of infrastructures. Anthropologists have used it more recently, but also the specific concept of culinary infrastructure that my colleague at U of T, Jeffrey Pilcher, has written about, and which has been used very fruitfully in a number of different ways. So yes, to look at the high altitude zones of empire, it's important to recognize and acknowledge the sources, not just the archives, but also the theories on which we draw, and that also brings two other sets of historiographies, Tense and Tender Ties, again Anne Stoller, but also the intimacies of empire, specifically, and a great historian of empire, Antoinette Burton, accompanied by Tony Ballantyne, the collection that they did. So in this part of the presentation, it's based not just on the collection that eventually came out as part of this volume co-edited with a number of multidisciplinary scholars of the Himalayas, but it actually evolved out of a workshop that we held at the Himalayan Hotel in Kalimpong. And we were able to invite a local audience, half of which was jeeped in from Darjeeling, many of whom turned out from the Kalimpong town. We hired the big hall at the hotel, and in fact, one of the local travel agents was very, very useful in kind of spreading the word, and people told us, hey, we came because, nothing much happens here. We were like, okay, what are these bunch of people doing? And they turned up and they told us later that it was really interesting. They didn't know what that was, what history meant, which I was very glad to hear since, well, having not taken history at college in India for that very precise reason. But we also had wonderful testimonies from the audience, including from a lady who told us how her father used to entertain Prince Peter, the exiled Greek prince, for lawn tennis matches. So what we did have is an audience where I was able to talk about how one of the testimonies, one of the purported testimonies from a porter that we have is these words, that the wages on the expedition were 12 annas a day, which should be raised to 1 rupee a day for every day above snow line. So if I went, I would make more money than I ever did before. And this particular porter had worked as one of the town porters before that. And so this was really an elevation in his economic circumstances that he was looking forward to, but of course his eventual turnout in his social status and indeed his entire way of life and the personality that was to emerge. And the next line that I thought I'd share from the text is they thought I was a Nepali and they wanted only Sherpas. So what we have also, we read in this text is that because he had come in tattered clothes through the jungles, the long journey from eastern Nepal, is that he literally had nothing to wear when he reached Darjeeling. So he had lodged with a fellow migrant from Nepal who was not a Sherpa and had borrowed his clothes. I assume that was one of the Nepali milkmen or other laborers in the town. And so when he went for his interview, he was rejected because they assumed he was a Nepali, not a Sherpa. And so for the next expedition, he made sure to look like a Sherpa, and he did get hired. And that is how Tenzing Norgay started his journey from Bhutia Porter to eventually Sherpa Tiger. But this is also meant to remind us that Sherpas do not emerge out of this wonderful high altitude vacuum that the British used to place them in. They were part of that larger laboring proletariat, and that it was men, women, and children who were there in that proletariat, as well as animals. So from after this slide, we will actually travel a bit in space to the neighboring town of Kalimpong, which is today not a very significant place, but was hugely significant till the 1960s. Political events have a really detrimental impact. So Kalimpong, and this is in fact one of the photographs that we spoke about yesterday morning, the Everest team at the Bhutan Darbar, the seat of the Bhutan government in Kalimpong, hosted by Raja and Rani Dorji. But you also see the gentleman on my right, the tall gentleman with the white hair is one-time moderator of the Church of Scotland, founder of the St. Andrews Colonial Homes, John Anderson Graham. And it's one of the ironies of history that Graham is remembered very, very strongly in Eastern India, Bengal, Bhutan and Nepal, and even Bangladesh, because most of the students for the homes, which runs as a public school in today's India, come from there. But he is virtually forgotten in Scotland. And I think it is part of the kind of embarrassment and amnesia where, and I will say that amongst missionaries or amongst imperial functionaries, Graham was actually a really interesting man and pretty enlightened for his times. So it is an interesting kind of footnote to history that Scotland now remembers the plant hunters, but feels that, you know, the very notion of somebody who's a missionary is so embarrassing that let's brush him out of history, while, you know, the part of a lot of what Graham did was actually went against what the church, you know, countenanced. So these homes, but before we get to the homes, because again, there was another reference yesterday and I actually went back and redid my slides because I felt it was important to provide some of the wider historical context. So this is a photograph of the children at the homes. Arrow again to the bare feet. And that, interestingly, is linked to two things. First is that, yes, as anyone who studied the working classes in Britain knows, working class autobiographies are full of, you know, the high cost of shoes, especially for children and growing feet. But also there was this idiosyncratic belief which was tied to that kind of British doctrine of the alleviating, improving effects of high altitudes, and bare feet were part of that cult of nature, improving culture, as it were. So we can talk about that later, but I want to actually go to a testimony that I acquired actually sitting with a lovely old gentleman not very far from Kew Garden, who had grown up in the homes, and I asked him for his most significant memories of his childhood in the Himalayas, and he mentioned something, and he mentioned another thing, which was he asked me to listen carefully, and he assumed I wouldn't know much about the Everest expedition, so he explained what the Everest expeditions were, and then he said, the climbers came to our assembly and spoke to us before they left Kalimpong for the mountains. More than 50 years later, I can still hear their words. So the momentous impact of a bunch of children at the assembly, because the homes was run on the pattern of a public school, that you had the school assembly in the morning where distinguished speakers would come, and amongst them were the various expedition leaders. So presumably on the morning before they set out, the night before, they would have had dinner with local luminaries, whether the Raja and Rani or Graham or others, hence the need for all that formal wear that we talked about yesterday, and the dress shirts. And the next morning you came to the homes. So what I asked my interviewee was, did you dream of joining them when you grew up to be a climber? And he said, oh no, none of us home boys thought that it was possible for us to become climbers. Now this, to understand this, perhaps I should explain a little bit more about the image you saw. What do these children look like to you? They are Eurasian, they are biracial to be exact. And I should say here, I always get emotional at this part because, as you all heard, I am from Assam. I'm also the mom of a biracial child. And when I do this part of the history, I realize that not that long ago, my daughter would have been regarded very differently, as would I. So these are one set of laboring women, the Ayahs. And again, there's been a lot of work on Ayahs. I can also point to the wonderful recent book by Arunima Datta on Ayahs, more the Ayahs from Malaysia. But this also unravels for us some of the ways in which it's complicated to look at these children. They were biracial. They would grow up to be Eurasians or Anglo-Indians, as was legally defined by British India from the 1930s. But they were also relatively more privileged, because it was only the relatively privileged who got to ride in dandies and go up the mountain. And this is how they came to the homes. But who were they? So that's where my clue about Assam comes in. So when I first went to Kalimpong, and in India people always ask you where you're from, and I didn't understand it then, because the minute I said I was from Assam, people would nod knowingly. Later I realized I thought I had come, as many, many people have come to Kalimpong and continue coming in quest of my own personal history. And indeed, the person who had sent me there had mentioned that she herself went there on a quest for her husband's possible child, who, as it turned out, had died. So who were those children? And I point here to the work of people like Durbha Ghosh. So those were the intimacies of empire, which, while they did not really exist in plain sight in the metropolitan spaces anymore in the 1900s, continued to thrive on the borderlands of empire well into the 1960s. And they were the children in the early years of British men who could be planters, who could be soldiers, who could be other functionaries attached or loosely connected to empire, and the mothers. It's actually the mothers I'm more interested in, because they are the missing ones. They are the invisible mothers, because they were borderlands women. And that is again where I get emotional, because the mothers that I have tracked down were Lepcha or Rong, Bengal coolies, as in Santals, Assam coolies, Nagas, Lushai, Khasi, Nepali. So this again is another aspect of that borderlands female proletariat. And that's where I want to also again point back to the discussion we had about sexuality in empire yesterday, to say it's not as simple as it sounds. Because it's not that these were predatory relationships all the time. First, we can never know, but certainly from the individual cases I have managed to track down, again, employing guerrilla tactics, because the Holmes was never happy to, and they stopped talking to me, because this is not, so I have great respect for William Dalrymple's work, but the trouble is every Anglo-Indian would now like to believe that, hey, it's much easier to believe that your grandmother was a Mughal princess than that they were an immiserated coolie woman. And I deliberately use the word coolie here, because it's important to understand coolitude. As Marina Warner and Carl Turpulli wrote in their wonderful book, coolitude should be as relevant a term as negritude. So part of that was that there were many relationships, many of which lasted for many years, but the common element in most of the cases, not all of the cases, was that the women got left because the men moved on either back to the metropole or moved on to legitimate marriages and children. And the Grahams' homes in most cases did require that the fathers paid, or somebody on behalf of the fathers paid, a stipend for their maintenance. It was 20 rupees, but in other cases there was actually no stipend. And one of the hardest tasks I've had as a historian, but also a rewarding one, is to explain to people when they provided me the papers, the homes refused, and basically asked me, did my grandmother love my grandfather or vice versa? And there's no simple answer to that. So this again is where the intimacies of empire tie into our stories of the other Everests. Because why that little boy knew he could not be a climber is because he wasn't white enough. The St. Andrews colonial homes indicated that they were being trained, and that is one of the main stories in my book, is how they were being trained to be the laboring reserve for the edges of empire. In a space like Australia and New Zealand, even if you're not quite white enough elsewhere, you could become white. But of course, ironically, many of them landed back in Britain, as did the person I quoted, because of the shortage of skilled labor, especially after the Second World War. So I met him, you know, the widower of a British wife, in a little house in Richmond. And also, it is sometimes a happy story. And the happy stories were the ones where the borderlands mothers came from communities like the Khasi or Naga groups, where illegitimacy didn't matter, and where the mothers actually wielded a lot more heft than, say, amongst some of the other communities like the tea estate laborers. And so certainly one, obviously I can't reveal who it is, but a very distinguished individual who I talked to, who was one of the last entrants to the homes, came there with siblings in the late 1950s, you know, proudly is at certain moments Anglo-Indian, at certain moments is a Northeasterner, like 3 of us who were in this room yesterday. And one of the other challenges in my public history has been to tell audiences in Northeast India that those children are us. So back to infrastructure. So market day at Darjeeling. One of the many markets, this is actually the one on the Kurseong Road, and this is the one held on Sunday, and so of course this is also the place where the more conventional missionaries would be trying to preach, and all kinds of mobile traders and all kinds of activities would be happening. But you can again see with the arrow, the basket appears, those implements appear, and this is the type of provisioning activity that was both the livelihood as in the off-season of the people who accompanied the porters, because the porters again did not exist in isolation. They had partners, they had children, they had families. In fact, what we can also gather, if we are interested in what laborers do outside of when they labor, is that we hear that it is activities like selling at the markets. The Kalimpong wool trade was of course very, very significant, continued to be down to fairly recent times. They sold the sweaters by the roadside, which again was a very familiar sight even to my generation. Or they worked with animals, and we will see another image of that. So another visible yet invisible picture. First, again, I have written elsewhere about tea and how there is, in fact, the adoption of culinary habits from British India, as in Indian/British style tea with milk, which is brewed, similar to what Starbucks likes to call its chai, which always raises my hackles. But the move away from pocha, the Tibetan tea, that becomes much more ceremonial and special and so on. And of course, one of the kind of recurring themes in exploration literature is how almost every European or American climber goes out of their way to tell you how disgusting it is. But here is the figure, and I use the word Sherpani because this is the word that was used in the archives, this is the word that was used for that generation, because again, it is the Sherpas and the Sherpanis who moved into Mugulan. So Mugulan was the name that was used for India. They moved to Mugulan, to British India for the opportunities, often they moved back and forth, but it is both the women and other ethnic/racial caste groups like the Tamangs, for instance, who kind of lost out on the ladder of upward laboring mobility, as it were, as well as have till very recently been also paid less than the kind of attention they should have gotten from scholars. And I think one of the reasons is because while there's a lot of amazing anthropological work, to my eternal frustration, it's very seldom that anthropologists actually talk to the historians or listen to the historians. And we need to channel the spirit of the great Bernard Cohn more often. So culinary infrastructure, and so this brings us down to the present day. So these are images, not my own, they're from a journalist who was commissioned by a British newspaper in 2014. So people trek approximately 10 kilometers to Namche Bazaar to transport goods that they sell, again, at the markets, the type of historical market we saw in Darjeeling. Sometimes carrying loads of up to 90 kilos, they're paid by distance and weight. Most deliveries are to tea houses and hotels catering for foreign trekkers. Last couple. So a female-run tea house, which is again an indispensable part of the local economy. And the photographer quotes the subject saying that her husband did not love climbing, but it was the only job available to him. The ponies reappear. I don't actually sadly have a historical photo of the pony riders, but this is what, if you were a canny Sherpa who saved your wages, that's what you did. You bought a pony and you gave rides to the children, and narrative after narrative talks about the rides. And certainly when I took my daughter to Darjeeling for the first time, she rode a pony called Pinky. I wish I had taken a photograph, but in lieu, this is one grabbed off the net. So this is Darjeeling Square, Chaurasta. This is from the 2000s, but you could see a similar picture all the way from the 1900s. So multi-species histories at work again. Last couple. So this is from, in fact, this is part of a newspaper article talking about how in the wake of the Nepal earthquake, the repercussion, because the laboring economy of British post-colonial India is also still largely dependent on laboring circulation from eastern Nepal. And so this is one of the Nepali women who left, and of course there was a big shortage of gas cylinders, cooking gas, because there was nobody to carry them. Sherpa spot, where you not only get momos, but Mexican and Italian cuisines, popcorn and peanuts. But this is the last slide, and this is what I invite all of us to think about. This is a wonderful film made by a bunch of young Sherpas. One of them incidentally reveals that he's the son of one of Hillary's cooks. And they tell us, not all Sherpas are climbers. With better educational opportunities, they, or we, no longer have to risk lives up in the world's tallest peaks to support themselves and their families. And what we saw was over a century of not just Sherpas, but the laboring proletariat, a circulating mobile laboring proletariat doing just that. Thank you.